Welcome to Us on the World. And this show is a follow on to several shows we've done in the past and taking things a lot further forward, which is the goal of Windows on the World now. We have this huge archive. If you go to the show that's linked to this one in the chat and the one I've just uploaded on our videos channel, it is actually from our huge archive and it talks about the Enlightenment, the age of what we're in now. And what age are we in now? Well, we're past the age of enlightenment. We are rather in the age of unenlightenment and dumbing down by the day. But this seems to have been a result of past governance. And that's what we're going to get in tonight. I did a show a few years ago called The Guides of Chaos, and it was about the Georgia Guidestones. The Georgia Guidestones, as most people know, are actually blown up in 2022 and knocked down. I recently came across a book which was called Common Sense Renewed, and this was actually by the author and inventor of the Georgia Guidestones. And what's really interesting is that the book which he wrote, which is based on the age of reason and how we can take things forward, is actually very moderate compared to what is going on now. In other words, this global communitarian stroke communist type imposition from above masquerading as global community, which we talk about a lot. And of course, if we don't talk about how we're managed and governed, then what can we actually do about it? And how do we actually respond to governance? Very important things, because out of this, of course, comes knowledge, and out of knowledge, we get satisfaction with what we're learning. And that is a very important thing. So this book came into my possession and it was 96 out of 100. I haven't actually got the physical book. I found a PDF online and it came up with other things, as often these things usually do. But I'm going to get into that book tonight and I'm going to compare it with what we have now and also with the predictions made in 1969, which was a lot before. This is, of course, the age of the late 60s going into the 80s, which is when the Georgia Guidestones were actually erected, I think about 1980. But the book was actually written in 1986 and it's called Common Sense Renewed by Robert Christian. He used a pseudonym, but he gave the names of all the people who'd been involved in the Guidestones, and it was including the mayor of Elberton and somebody else. There was a good documentary actually called Dark Skies Over Elberton. But what I think is so fascinating about this is that when we look at what they're saying, the people who put the Georgia Guidestones up do not appear to be the real baddies. The real baddies took over. And it's quite interesting because they associated themselves with the Rosicrucians. The Rosicrucians also seems to have been a steered and infiltrated movement going back to Elizabeth I when she was involved with Frederick in the Palatine. And we were talking about what is now Germany, Westphalia, and where the real advances were being made as far as civilization went in Europe. So this is all very fascinating. And he starts his book with, is it not a good thing to encourage an unending search for wisdom and spiritual insight? Well, that's what these shows are all about. So I would say yes. It was him and the mayor of Elberton and a few locals who were solely responsible for the Georgia Guidestones. So the corporate elite who have taken over were not this group. This was just a group of locals that who knows what their connections were. But I just think it's very interesting as to what we've got now. So I'm going to give you an interpretation, which is from my slideshow, of what world government actually is and global governance, because this is very important. So world government is structureless in the eyes of the public. In other words, it's not political parties, and it's a system which is imposed in many different countries in the same way. And that is the trick, that it's a template which is very easy to impose. But the actual slide says the term world government is a misdirection for those who know little about the governance system. And for those who do not, it is a conspiracy theory. This governance is a spider's web of organizations which the public have no idea work together. The public are always placed between two lies, two parties and two opposing views. All political parties, though, are one solid mechanism working towards one aim. And that is, in essence, what global governance is all about. And in a way, what the author of Common Sense Renewed was saying. But before we get into the bulk of the show, let's have a couple of quotes. Carroll Quigley, Tragedy and Hope, 1966. The global elite's aim is nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in the private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. The system was to control in a feudalistic fashion by the central banks of the world, acting together in concert through frequent conferences and private meetings. Well, there we have sustainable development. There we have the communitarian system. There we have the City of London project, which is based on fake environmentalism. That's what it is. So we want to compare that quote with this next quote. And the forthcoming audio book that I'm going to put out will be covering all of this, by the way. Okay, let's have the next quote and see how it compares with that first quote from Carroll Quigley in 1966. Okay, here we go. The only hope for the planet is that the industrial civilizations collapse. Isn't it our responsibility to bring this about? Well, that was Maurice Strong, co-chair of the World Economic Forum 1972 Conference on Human Environment. He was the head of the UN Conference on Environment and Development, UNEP as it's called, and the instigator of the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. An absolute hypocrite, and he used the fake green agenda to basically corporatize and loot the Western economies. That's really what it was all about. So those two quotes are actually doing the same thing. So what Carroll Quigley was saying in 1966, Maurice Strong was saying in 1972, and even more in 1992, where he made some very bold statements. And all of those are in our archive if you look up UN global governance. So as we know, the Georgia Guidestones were destroyed in 2022, just a couple of years ago. And those behind the Guidestones, it appears, are not those who are in charge now, because what we have is just technocratic plunder on the back of corporations. So Common Sense Renewed stated, let these Guidestones be a guide in the age of reason, an age of reason. And let's just go over what the Georgia Guidestones actually said. One was to maintain humanity under 500 million in perpetual balance with nature. What we have to remember about this is depopulation was the main agenda during these times. The overpopulation was the thing that was being pushed. Of course, since Malthusian times, it had been pushed, but now it's used in a very malicious way. And also what we have to remember is global population, apart from in a few countries like Nigeria, is collapsing. It's already collapsed. So this goal has been achieved. And remember what it said in the Global Biodiversity Assessment of 1995. I'm not expecting you to, by the way, but it cited a paper which said the ideal global population is 1 billion. This became known in globalist terms as the golden billion. So in other words, they wanted to create a serf class which was there merely to service them under technocratic rule. And as we can see now, that's not going to work, which is a good thing. So what they also said was that in the meantime, 2 to 3 billion would be acceptable. So 2 to 3 billion people living at a lowered standard of living, i.e. lower than the middle classes in, say, America, would be okay. So we've seen in the past few years how this depopulation can be rapidly achieved. And of course, we've had many videos taken down for just mentioning it. So let's get on to number 2 now. Guide reproduction wisely, improving fitness and diversity. Well, this is interesting because they do talk about controlling population, and they are anti-abortion in this book. Common Sense Renewed, written by Robert Christian, the author of what was on the Georgia Guidestones. So when we get to 1969, and this talk we're going to be featuring tonight by Dr. Richard Day, who worked for Planned Parenthood, which was part of what is now, of course, the Gates Foundation. Well, what Day was saying was so draconian and shocking that people couldn't believe it. And that was in 1969. So the Guidestones and this book was actually published in 1986. So there's a huge difference. It's almost as if these people didn't know about another agenda, but they were kind of imposing what they thought the problems were and the proposed solutions to that. Of course, at the time when this was written in the 80s, and this was never mentioned in the 60s, there was a huge propaganda of East and West and the idea of nuclear war between Russia and the West. That was the huge big scare story in the 80s, was this idea of a nuclear holocaust. So let's go on to number 3. Guide reproduction wisely, improving fitness and diversity. Yes. Sorry, that was number 2. 3, unite humanity with a living new language. Well, this is nothing new, because when we go back to people who were trading 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, and even the time of the Phoenicians, they had a global way of language where they could do their accounting and everyone would understand it. And also, we've talked about Frederick Slater finding out in Australia about a global language that was common to people who went all over the world. So the idea of a global language is nothing new. It's thousands of years old and probably a good idea. Of course, in the 60s and 70s, we had Esperanto, which just failed miserably and was never heard of again. I think Linguista or Lingua was another one, but they never really went anywhere. They were just sort of thrust into the academic background. So number 4 is rule passion, faith, tradition, and all things with tempered reason. They do bring reason into it a lot, even though the people who authored the Georgia Guidestones were all devout Christians, which is quite interesting. So they'd taken a leaf out of Thomas Paine's book, which in my view was the beginning of scientism, consensus, and the new system which we have now, which is basically you defer to people who aren't experts, who are called experts, and they lie to you for the global corporate looting of the planet. That's the way sustainable development works. So that's quite interesting. 5, protect peoples and nations with fair laws and just courts. Now, we get on to number 6 here. It says, let all nations rule internally, resolving external disputes in a world court. So this we can see as kind of happened through the UN. But the UN was never mentioned in this book, Common Sense Renewed, written by Robert Christian, who authored the Georgia Guidestones. He never once mentioned the UN, which is quite interesting as well, because this was in the 80s. And of course, the UN became very powerful by the end of the 80s and into the early 90s after the Rio conference, and then through the impositions of local councils. So the global to local agenda was pushed in after that. And by the year 2000, of course, we had Global 2000 report. It's almost as if these people were a bit naive and didn't know about these plans. That's what I found interesting about his book, because there's no reference to any of this. Whereas Dr. Richard Day in 1969, in this off-the-cuff lecture at Mount Sinai University, to a group of doctors, was telling them the most draconian things, which we're going to get into during the show. But you can look at a show called Order of New Barbarians at windowsontheworld.net, and you will find every single paper and the cleaned up audios of the person who's relating, or Lawrence Dunnigan. And it was in the 80s, so he didn't really speak out until the 80s. But this Dr. Richard Day lecture, everything in it is absolutely spot on with what's happened. And that's a lot more draconian than what these people were saying. So somewhere along the way, it looks like things got hijacked. So yes, number 8 is quite interesting. Sorry, number 7, avoid petty laws and useless officials. Well, couldn't we do with that one now? Avoid petty laws and useless officials. How many useful, useless officials do we have? In fact, in a lot of countries, 1 in 5 people is working for the state. And that is going to actually multiply. So what they were saying, the opposite has happened. We have a much bigger administrative system. These people were actually for a form of self-governance, but within certain parameters. In other words, how do we make people comply with basic law? It was a philosophical argument, and that they were trying to, I suppose, coerce people, but in the right way, whereas communitarianism imposes something on people which masquerades as their community. It's a total lie. So this is quite interesting as well. Yes, it's not the same as all rights come with responsibilities, which is the communitarian idea. In other words, that there's this idea of community rights. Well, there's no such thing as community rights, because all rights come from the rights of one individual within a community. So if you've not got individual rights, then you have no rights at all. Once they talk about community rights, that's an imposition from above, masquerading as the thing called a community, imposing a tyranny on you. So your inalienable rights disappear under the communitarian system. But these people were actually not saying that, which I found quite interesting. So number 9 is prize truth, beauty, love, and seeking harmony with the infinite, which is what we talk about on these shows. In other words, scientism has failed. Technocracy is failing. And if we do not have any connection to the divine aspect of nature and God and something bigger than ourselves, then we fail. Ultimately, we're going to fail, because everything that is of any use comes from inspiration. And that's the bit that they miss out. Okay, you can have drones. Ex-communist countries and communist countries still have these drones in administration. There are people who are bio-robotized by communism, which actually finished in the early 90s in some countries. So this is a way of delineating that. In other words, what they were talking about was nothing like what is being imposed. So number 10 was be not a cancer on the earth, leave room for nature. And they reiterate that, leave room for nature. So there were some good things in there, and some things you can say which have been hijacked and pushed into something very tyrannical. So let's now go to 1969, Dr. Richard Day, who worked for Planned Parenthood. He actually stated permission would have to be sought from the state to have children. Can you see the difference? So this is 1969. This is 10, 12 years before the Guidestones were put up. So I find this quite interesting, that the difference, because this is actually what's happened. Abortion would be encouraged, which of course it has been. And Robert Christian said abortion is evil, but sometimes we must choose the lesser evil. So he kind of sat on the fence about that. So we can talk now about how it turned out, the global financial carbon cult, which came out of the City of London by 2008. So we can see that what was on the Georgia Guidestones was never actually fulfilled, and it was taken over with something else. I think that's the main point here. Let's now have a quote from the fake environmental movement to see how all this fits in with today. Leader of Earth First, Dave Foreman. Earth First, of course, bring these court cases. And I think they brought one in 2018 and were laughed out of court because Miles Allen, the climate modeler, had made it look as though there was far more CO2 in the atmosphere than there actually was. And he got denounced in court for doing that. That's a side issue, but an important one. So the leader, Dave Foreman, said, my 3 main goals would be to reduce human population to about 100 million worldwide, destroy the industrial infrastructure, and see wilderness with its full complement of species returning throughout the world. And as we know, this became UN policy through rewilding. So this also became part of the governance system. Well, what they want to impose, they haven't completely done all this yet, but the legislation is there for them to do it. We have to remember that. So let's now go back to the Order of New Barbarians. And this is, I'll give you a bit of exposition about this if you haven't heard of it. They were the recollections of Dr. Lawrence Donegan regarding a lecture he attended on March 20th, 1969, at a meeting of the Pittsburgh Pediatric Society. And the predictions made in this off-the-cuff lecture have all come true, which is why it's so important. The lecturer at that gathering of pediatricians identified in tape 3 of the Order of New Barbarians was a Dr. Richard Day, who actually died in 1989. At the time, Dr. Day was professor of pediatrics at Mount Sinai Medical School in New York. Previously, he had served as medical director of Planned Parenthood. And the speaker said that his purpose was to tell the people gathered there, the pediatricians, about changes which would be brought about in the next 30 years or so that an entirely new world system would be in operation before the turn of the century. As he put it, we plan to enter the 21st century with a running start. And he stated that everything was in place and nothing will stop us now. So the audacity from Dr. Day in 1969 compared with what they were saying in 1980 is quite stark, a big difference. And Dr. Day said, some of you will think I'm talking about communism. Well, what I'm talking about is much bigger than communism. He indicated that there is much more cooperation between the East and the West than most people realize. Whereas in the Georgia Guidestones, which was 12 years later, well, more than that, isn't it? So we got the actual book coming out in 86, and the Guidestones went up around 1980, I think. Well, that's quite interesting. So we have here an insider, Dr. Richard Day, saying that there was already more cooperation between East and West, whereas the people who put the Georgia Guidestones up were actually really scared of this nuclear confrontation between East and West. Well, Dr. Day knew this wasn't going to happen. So that in itself is quite interesting. The Guidestones author claimed in 1986 that communism was the big threat to the West. And of course, Marxism especially. Now, this is interesting because Marxism is now encouraged. It is behind communitarianism. If you look at all the trade unions, especially in the UK, they're all run by Marxists. Their Marxists are in lots of positions in local government, and it runs very nicely alongside with communitarianism. So the enemy of those people who put up the Georgia Guidestones was communism and Marxism. So Robert Christian, I won't abbreviate it too much. Robert Christian does talk about consensus by experts, whereas Day talked about imposing fake science as consensus. Another big difference. In Dr. Day's introduction, he commented that he was free to speak at this particular time. He would not have been able to say what he was about to say even a few years earlier. That's what he said in the lecture. But he was free to speak at this time because, as he said, everything is in place and nothing can stop us now. So it's the 3 A's, isn't it? Audacity, audacity, and audacity. That's all they've got. Because when you look behind the audacity, there's nothing there. And this, I think, is the key point. Once you stand up against this kind of governance, you find out it's an empty shell. There's nothing behind the curtain. This is what I found when dealing with local authorities. This is what I was trying to get over to people years and years, 15 years ago, which still hasn't happened, of course, because now we're on to painting red lines on roundabouts and waving flags about. So this circus of stupidity is very much a part of the system that Dr. Richard Day was talking about, that people would actually be dumbed down, enjoy it, and would be put into servitude and would do it willingly, but by coercion. So, yes, he went on to say that most people don't understand how government operates. Well, this is the thing we've said all the time, isn't it? And even people in high positions in government, including the US government, don't really understand how and where decisions are made. Now, this is so true because I have talked to people who have been politicians and who've been movers and shakers in the media world, especially as far as news goes. And when I talk about how governance works and this very simple template, they agree with me, but by the end of the evening, they're going back to, well, this Tory government has ruined the country. And you think, which bit of it did they miss? Well, they missed all of it because they've been pre-programmed into something they just can't get out of or see beyond. I spoke to someone from XRO News. Remember that? It was set up by people from The Sun, but it was through somebody that I knew called Kevin Cahill, who wrote a book called Who Owns the World? And he gave me a copy of this book. It was about land ownership, very interesting book. And Kevin had some good ideas, but he was absolutely stuck when it came to how governance actually works. And this was the problem with all the people from XRO News. I gave them all the evidence and all the papers to look at, and nothing ever came from it. And of course, XRO News went down the pan, and it's now something else. And now we've got these even worse publications like Byline Times, which is where a lot of those sort of people went, which is to me astonishing. After I talk to these sort of people, this is what I can't understand, that you can talk to people and they go, yeah, that makes sense. Oh, I see that happening. I see that happening locally. And then they'll go back to, yeah, but it's the Tories or it's this Starmer government regime. Well, when Starmer came in, I just said, global mafia win UK election. That's all you needed to know. So what we had here with Dr. Day was not an outsider looking in, like the people like Robert Christian, who was the main inspiration, if you like, behind the Georgia Guidestones. But Dr. Day was an insider looking out. Very big difference there. So when we look at this new governance system, it really did start with New Labour. By 2010, of course, we had the big society, and now we've got the global mafia. Global governance operated through the UN and the WHO, the pandemic, etc. And I think we should now go back to common sense renewed, because we're going to get into the big differences between these two groups in the next few minutes. So Common Sense Renewed, just to recap, was written by an author calling himself Robert Christian. He admitted he was doing the book under a pseudonym, 1986. But Robert Christian, of course, reversed of the Father R.C., Christian Rosenkreutz. So they were obviously very involved with Rosicrucian beliefs. And of course, the early Rosicrucians were following the Reformation in Germany and Europe. They were infiltrated. And as we've stated on these shows, the Age of Enlightenment got infiltrated through Kabbalah and the Freemasonic elements of all this. And then it really started to go downhill by the late 1700s. But these people were probably part of the thought group of the original Rosicrucians, which was about this society of knowledge, which got infiltrated. I mean, you can look up Adam Hasselmeyer, and he was the notary public for the Archduke Maximilian. And once Maximilian found out that he was openly against the Jesuits, because the RC were originally opposing the Jesuits. That's a very important point, because the Jesuits were formed to overthrow the Rosicrucians. The Rosicrucian movement had become quite big, especially with royalty. Elizabeth I was very much involved in it. Of course, then we get John Dee and all these people. But when we had the European royalty involved in it, and the Reformation and the Protestantism that had come in, this led to the 30-year war in France, of course, across Europe, the Spanish. And that 30-year war was purely about the Reformation. It was about the power of the Reformation and the Protestant uprising against the Catholic Church. And of course, the Jesuits were the people who put Adam Hasselmeyer onto the galleys for 4 years as a galley slave. And if you look at it, it's a very interesting story, but of course, horrendous infiltration. And I think we know who's doing that by now. So let's carry on. So yes, the book came out, Common Sense Renewed, in 1986. I have copy number 96 out of 100. It's just a PDF you can download off the internet. And it was published by the Graphic Publishing Company, Lake Mills, Iowa. And really, what we have to take away from all this before we get on to the next bit is that technocracy has already failed in terms of progress and civilization. And we can see that. Technocracy has already failed. So we do need to rebuild a new civilization. And that new civilization will be built on inspiration and people actually using real knowledge and becoming knowledgeable. Because you can't have a civilization without high levels of knowledge. And we've got low levels of knowledge now. In fact, we've got no knowledge. So technocracy has already failed. So yes, we're now just run by plunderers and global corporations. I'm going to give you a quote from Robert Christian. He says, "My personal religious beliefs are based imperfectly on those of Christ, as adapted to my understanding of reality." So quite humble statements he makes throughout the book. He says, "I can easily live in peace with others who hold different views, for I recognize the uncertainty of all human knowledge and the disparity of opinion which often marks appraisals by different individuals who view a common subject from widely separate viewpoints. We are in a critical era. Population pressures are creating political and economic crises throughout the world. These make more difficult the building of a rational world society. So here we have an interesting combination of Christianity and rationalism, which was in a way what Thomas Paine in the 1700s was about to destroy. And that's exactly what did happen. He says, I am the originator of the Georgia Guidestones and the sole author of its inscriptions. I have had the assistance of a number of other American citizens in bringing the monument into being. We have no mysterious purpose or ulterior motives. We seek common sense pathways to a peaceful world without bias for particular creeds or philosophies, yet our message is in some areas controversial. I have chosen to remain anonymous in order to avoid debate and contention. Our guides must stand on their own merits. Stonehenge and other vestiges of ancient thought arouse our curiosity, but carry no message for human guidance. The Guidestones have been erected to convey certain ideas across time to others. We hope that these silent stones and their inscriptions will merit a degree of approval and acceptance down the centuries. So to them, this was a long-term project. And by their silent persistence, hasten in small ways the dawning of an age of reason. So he says, 2 interested citizens of Elberton, Georgia have been instrumental in bringing this project to completion. They are not sponsors, but have given invaluable assistance. They have served without compensation through motives of public service, even though they may not necessarily agree with the author in all of his beliefs. So it sounds like they were a bit idealistic, but they didn't have a particular focused idea of how things were going to come about, which is, of course, where it went wrong. He goes on to say, Mr. Wyatt Martin, who has an interest in Georgia's history, served as the project's fiscal agent. He assisted in selecting a site for the monument that would provide public access while remaining within budgetary limits. He enlisted community support for a small public park as a site for the monument. Mr. Joe Fendley, presently the mayor of Elberton, so it was the mayor of Elberton who was involved, quarried the massive stones, engraved on them our message, and erected them on the site about 8 miles north of Elberton. So there's no mystery as to who actually constructed the Georgia Guidestones. It was the mayor of Elberton, Joe Fendley. He goes on to say, my personal religious beliefs are based imperfectly on those of Christ. We've had that. I thought it was worth repeating, as adapted to my understanding of reality. Yes. So he goes on to say, human reason is the most powerful agency on planet Earth. Truth will prevail when we seek it honestly. Now, that is quite a profound and simple statement, and very true. Truth will prevail when we seek it honestly. In other words, not through deception and lies, which is what has happened. He said the US and the Soviet Union could be partners, again, going back to the Cold War. Dr. Day, of course, said there was more cooperation between East and West than most realize. So there was no top-down control defined as community by the Georgia Guidestones author. No top-down control as defined by community, actually. No imposition from above masquerading as a community. No mention of all rights come with responsibilities, or no mention of how people could be steered into acting for the common good, as in the 1987 publication, Our Common Future. So if we think about it, Common Sense Renewed was published in 1986. I don't know whether it was published before that because it doesn't say, but the publication date I've got is 1986, and there was only 100 ever published. Apparently, it says 96 out of 100. I've got number 96. So 97, Our Common Future came out, which was a global communist document, all based around consensus through climate change. So this, I think, is really interesting. It's almost as if these people were very naive. Or if they knew about this, they weren't saying anything. Could be both, I suppose. But after reading his book, I'm not convinced of that. So was the reason the stones were blown up because the ideals had been hijacked and subverted? This is a new way of looking at it. So in other words, the Georgia Guidestones may not have been blown up by somebody who was against the New World Order. They may have been blown up by the very people who installed them because the project had been hijacked. That was a very useful bit of insight that I got from looking at it all. And it actually started to make more sense to me. So what we have now is not what was presented by the author. It was stated that if they were knocked down, the stones, that they should be rebuilt. Of course, they're not going to be rebuilt. So that would indicate to me that possibly they were blown up by those who were involved in the construction of them. Because if these people were still behind the stones and they got blown up, they would have been rebuilt. Something to think about there. So is the rebuilding the real opposition to the current plunder and the fake green cover story that's going on now? Robert Christian was an anti-communist and anti-Marxist, and he was still very, very tied up with the overpopulation, the Cold War, and the possibility of a nuclear war. These are recurrent themes within the book. So what came across to me was that he wasn't some kind of self-professed elitist. He was somebody who was genuinely trying to work things out. That's what came across in the book, which I found most interesting. So let's get back to what he said. Wiser and better informed legislative bodies will establish a proper order of priorities among the many problems facing society today. Well, you could say that's gone wrong. Truly pressing problems, such as the need for controlling our borders, regulating human population, and limiting government spending in a sensible manner, will be considered with appropriate urgency. Well, of course, the opposite's happened, hasn't it? And better qualified administrators will hopefully avoid many of the abuses which have developed in our governmental machinery since 1776. So what comes across also is these people were kind of true American patriots in the real sense of the word, not in the fake sense of the word, in the sense of the people who went out there on the Mayflower, perhaps, in a way. So Robert Christian talks of slums being eliminated, whereas Dr. Day states that areas will become slums to introduce crime, drugs, and a struggle to get into these places where the richer people lived. So that's the basis of that Hunger Games kind of idea, isn't it? I'd never thought much of that film, to be honest, even though people quote it a lot. A bit like The Matrix. I didn't like that either. all the truthers quote it, don't they? Neo said, God. However, let's move on with more important things. So yes, Dr. Day was stating in 1969 that a hostile environment would be introduced, which has of course happened, because what we call diversity has actually separated people even more. So what you will get is you will get gangs going around stabbing people. There is no pride in community. There's litter all over the streets. This is what Dr. Day was saying would be enforced. This is what was going to happen in cities, and that has happened. So R.C. Christian, of course, now we've got the communitarian thing, which tries to pretend that isn't there. So we have the 20 mile per hour zones, which are merely a way of closing off areas. They're a way of closing down roads so that you've only got one way in and out of areas. That's what the 20 mile per hour zones were for, because when they started that in Waltham Forest, they were putting up helicopters every night all over London. Every pub that I did a gig in said there was a helicopter up about 3 o'clock in the morning. And they were all over London for about 3 weeks, maybe more. And they were mapping, this is what I believe, they were mapping the ways that people could get in and out of places. So they did a load of new mapping on the 20 mile per hour zones and these, these LTNs, low traffic neighborhoods, there to actually keep people in. So they're not what people think. And of course, they're to get you out of the car, because once you lose freedom of transport, you've pretty much lost everything. That means you're locked down. And that's the interesting part of the whole, what comes out in the Dr. Day lecture, really. But R.C. Christian, he actually talks about the importance of the family unit, whereas Dr. Day said that the family will become less important and people will eat on their own. They won't eat at the same dinner table. People will live on takeaways. They will stop having children. But R.C. Christian emphasized the importance of the family unit, and there's nothing anti-religious in his book at all, whereas the Dr. Day speech really does talk about the end of all religion. And so, yeah, let's now get to what Dr. Richard Day said in 1969 and compare it Yes, let's go back to the initial quote. Some of you will think I'm talking about communism. Well, what I'm talking about is much bigger than communism. At that time, he indicated that there is much more cooperation between East and West than most people realize. So he talked of a deception and the real versus the stated goals. In other words, the real reason was never the reason given to the public. And that's what we talk about all the time, the two lies as well, putting people in between two lies, two political parties, two arguments that are of no consequence whatsoever. And we see this happening over and over again. I think Britain's a great place for the social engineering because now we've got people arguing over flags, then they argue over something else. They're arguing against immigration at these centres, but they're not going against the actual agenda at all. They're just enabling it by going along with this stuff, and that's what Dr. Richard Day was saying. So you've got the real and the stated goals. And Robert Christian said that it's probable that humanity possesses even now the knowledge needed to establish limited but effective world government. So that's what R.C. Christian said, that knowledge must be propagated in the consciousness of all mankind. Well, you could say there's two ways of looking at that. That could be either through self-development or through mind control. You know, you can interpret that in two ways, can't you? The hearts of our human family must be touched and warmed to welcome a global rule by reason. And then he goes on about the Georgia Guidestones again, saying it has no mysterious or ulterior motives, seeks common sense pathways to a peaceful world without bias. And yes, let's get back onto now the work of Dr. Richard Day. But before we do that, here's a note. As usual, I've made far too many notes here. This show would be about 3 hours long if I used it all. Yes, I think also it's worth repeating what he said, Robert Christian. He said, is it not a good thing to encourage an unending search for wisdom and spiritual insight? Well, of course it is. And he said that there would be a new universal language for both men and machines. So they kind of anticipated what was going on, but he did talk of the stable and secure family unit. Single child families are mentioned, but not as draconian as Dr. Richard Day. And also interesting, they kind of hinted at remote working, which was not explicitly stated, but it was kind of suggested. But when we sum it all up, it was anti-communist and Marxist, and it was written well before communism fell in the late 80s, early 90s. And it was before the World Wilderness Congress of 1987, just about. His book came out in 86, before Our Common Future and Communitarianism, before the UN and Rio 92. So Robert Christian stated that population would be balanced with resources, advocates family unit, not state control. So the family would be the center of governance within your immediate environment. Big difference there between the technocratic system, which we have now. So somewhere this new communism took over. There's no mention of any loss of inalienable rights, the God-given rights that we have, or rights of a community. There's no mention of community in it at all, which is really interesting. As Our Common Future came out a year later, and you can't get off a page without it talking about community. So that's quite interesting too. So it looks like these people were anti-communist, and the ex-communists, and the globalists and the banks and corporations got on board with their system of plunder, which suited the people who took to the new system. So yes, there's the more draconian and tyrannical aims now, which were revealed in 1969 by Dr. Richard Day. Now, frequently during this lecture, he would say, there is just no other way. There's no other way. So they were absolutely adamant that what they were doing was right. And as, of course, he said, we're entering the 21st century with a running jump, and nothing can stop us now. This seemed to come as a sort of apology, said Lawrence Donegan, who was there, particularly when at the conclusion of describing some particularly offensive changes, for example, the promotion of drug addiction, which we'll get into shortly, said Dr. Donegan in his introduction. So let's get some of the main headers from what Dr. Richard Day said in 1969. People will have to get used to change. What do we hear from every council? The C word. What do we hear in every government document? The C word, change. There would be the real and the stated goals. Permission would have to be sought from the state to have babies. There would be a redirection of the purpose of sex, sex without reproduction, and reproduction without sex. Interesting. Contraception universally available to all. Another really interesting thing that Dr. Day predicted in 1969 was that contraceptives would be placed in full open view in shops. So when you go to a supermarket, now when you go to checkout, there's the Durex. That wasn't like that in 1969. It wasn't even like that in the 70s. You would have to go into a shop and actually ask for them. And even in barbers' shops, they would ask you something like, something for the weekend, sir. That'll be a packet of Durex. So it was all under the counter. And it was really interesting because in 1969, when it was under the counter, Dr. Richard Day was saying it's going to be in full view. You're going to see, and what do you see when you go into a newsagent shop, into a corner shop, into the any shop that you go into in London that's like a bit of a newsagent stroke mini market? They're on the checkout, aren't they? So that was really interesting to me. Only a small thing, but wow, that really did happen. So yes, sex education as a tool of world government. Well, we have, of course, the Gates Foundation, which is hand in hand with all this lot. Tax-funded abortion as population control. Well, we've got that. Encouraging homosexuality, anything goes. In other words, the LGBTQ stuff was brought in through what Dr. Day was talking about. Really, this was about to create groups that weren't groups to be used as biological weapons against other groups. Again, the real and the stated goals, and also to actually give people this idea that there's a community when there isn't a community. So you create a community and weaponize them as bio-robots, and they become bio-robots with their placards and their ideologies, which they've been told to spout, and then they go out. It's like you've got the fake left versus the fake right. How many years have we been talking about that on here? So if Tommy Robinson goes for a march, there's a so-called bunch of anti-fascists there, but they're all doing the same thing. Nothing's being achieved. So that's what he's talking about. He said families were to diminish in importance. Euthanasia and the demise pill would come in. Of course, we've had that. What about this suicide pod, this controversial thing that came in Switzerland? And as far as the demise pill goes, we've seen that in the old people's home during COVID. Remdesivir, and people being pumped with drugs while they're put on life support machines, which are basically straining their lungs. And so everything that Dr. Day said has come about. The demise pill, of course, they're talking about that anyway, but the demise pill is always there and always was. It was called the Liverpool Care Pathway until they stopped calling it the Liverpool Care Pathway. Just call it palliative care, end of life care. So it doesn't matter what you're going to hospital with. If you're over a certain age, it'll be end of life care. So your life ends there. That's what he was saying. He said there would be limited access to affordable medical care. Well, that's what's happening in the UK. The NHS was collapsed years ago, and it is already private. The public just haven't been told. And he said it would be eliminating the elderly easier. That's all come true. Planning the control over medicine. Medical care would be closely connected to work. If you don't work or can't work, you won't have access to medical care. The days of hospitals giving away free care would gradually wind down to where it was virtually non-existent. The other thing he said was it's going to be the end of the individual GP, the general practitioner. They will all be corporates working for corporations, and that's happened, of course. The elimination of private doctors, not private as in the UK when you pay to go privately. He's talking about what we call the NHS in the UK, the elimination of your local GP, the elimination of the local GP, which is happening, of course, because now it's just an interface where you have to type in your symptoms and they decide whether they're going to see you or not. He would say there'd be new, difficult to diagnose and untreatable diseases, suppressing cancer cures as a means of population control, inducing heart attacks as a form of assassination. That's not as far-fetched as it sounds. I know people here won't think it's at all far-fetched, but if we look at people like Robin Cook, that was very puzzling as to how he just dropped dead very quickly after criticizing the government. And that was years ago, but There was another John Smith. He was another one, wasn't he? He was buried on Iona. He was meant to have dropped dead instantly of a heart attack. May, of course, have done that. But when you start looking at this, he was looking at a way of killing people without anybody knowing about it. Of course, they know how to do that. Education as a tool for accelerating the onset of puberty and evolution, blending all religions. He said the old religions will have to go. A big change from what they were saying in Common Sense Renewed. He said the Bible would be changed through revision of key words. And of course, we had the Schofield Bible, and that was what really subverted a lot of the Reformation, the Protestants, into becoming Zionists. But the changing of the Bible through the revision of key words has happened, of course. The churches will help us with this new system. And have the churches helped them? Wow. The Pope's helped them more than anybody. The Pope's been on board with all of it. The Church of England is on board with all of it. We can look at the Orthodox Church. They're pretty much on board with it, even though they'll have a surface that says they aren't. And of course, the Catholic Church, the Roman Church, absolutely on board with everything globalist. So people were saying, well, won't the churches stop this? And he said, no, they're going to help us. And they are. They're all change agents in the church. There aren't any priests left in the UK. They're just empty, hollow shells who want to sit on the fence and appease everybody, but never, ever say anything true or spiritually rewarding. They want to be inclusive, but to the exclusion of anything of any depth or importance. I've had quite a few arguments with them, actually. They always back down, which is interesting. Because you can say, well, this is the house of God, isn't it? And they have to go, well, yes, well, it is. So you can use that one. Restructuring education as a tool of indoctrination. Well, that's Common Core education, which came out of the UN, Robert Mueller, in the 70s. Common Core education, the new education system, was instigated by Robert Mueller in the UN. We've done many shows on that. Go to the free books page at Windows on the World, and you can download the documents where Robert Mueller was talking to Gaia, and he was the Under-Secretary General of the United Nations. He started off all the New Age conferences that the UN got involved with, and brought in the Lucis Trust, Brahma Kumaris, the fake Hindu groups to get the Westerners into the wilderness of the mind. All of that was Common Core through Robert Mueller. It was about the Gaia religion, and he spent ages saying that the earth was crying because there was too many people on it. He did it in the first person of the earth, and it was him channeling Gaia. And you can download those documents if you don't believe me. They're on the free books page. He said more time would be spent in schools, but they wouldn't learn anything. It's happened, doesn't it? Controlling who has access to information. Well, of course, it's so compartmentalized now, and most people have no information at all about anything. If they want to argue with you, they have a certain amount of sound bites, and then they shut down because they can't argue. And of course, that's why we have hate speak, because they hate you to speak. Schools as the hub of the community. That's happened. Some books would just disappear from the libraries. That happened years ago. Changing of laws very, very quickly. The encouragement of drug abuse to create a jungle atmosphere. Well, of course, now we know that the police are involved with major drug dealers. That's well known, especially in counties like Kent. The police are the drug dealers. And of course, that's always gone on. But it's now official, if you like. Alcohol abuse. Yeah, well, that's risen, hasn't it? Restrictions on travel. Restrictions on travel. Who'd have thought? The need for more jails. They're building more jails in the UK, aren't they? That's a good example. Using hospitals as jails, he was saying here. That's quite interesting, isn't it? Well, hospitals can be jails, because if you are actually put in there, maybe they section you or something, you are literally in jail. And now it only takes a medical professional to actually get you sectioned. One medical professional. So that could be someone from G4S. And they also become your lawyer, G4S, when you get arrested. And this stuff is all about corporate corruption, just based on greed, really. So it'd be that he said there'd be no more security, no more things would be were changing all the time, constant change to destabilize people. Nothing is permanent. Streets would be rerouted, renamed. Areas you had not seen in a while would become unfamiliar. Now, of course, older people have always said, "Oh, I don't recognize it round here now." But in actual fact, that's the gap there's got a lot smaller. I can go back to London, say, in places I haven't been for 2 years, and they are unrecognizable. So that's changed massively in the past 10 to 15 years, especially in the past 10. Curtailment of American industrial preeminence. Well, industrial preeminence in the West was actually shut down through the Lima Declaration in 1975. But of course, we saw the advent of it in the 80s when outsourcing to Taiwan and Japan started. Shifting populations and economies, tearing social roots apart. Well, of course, that's happened. People have become quite rootless. That is not necessarily a bad thing if you are philosophically strong in wisdom. It doesn't really matter. But it matters if you are being herded around and you haven't a clue what's going on. Sport as a tool of social change. Interestingly, as a side issue, he said you'd see loads of people running everywhere, jogging. He said you see people jogging. In 1969, you didn't see people jogging much then. But now you see, like, everyone's jogging, aren't they? Apart from the fellow who invented jogging, and he dropped dead while he was jogging. Look it up. Quite funny, that. Sex and violence, sex and violins, sex and violins, inculated through entertainment. Well, I can't watch a lot of the crap that is in movies now. I don't know about you, but just fast cutting and stupid fight scenes and special effects do nothing for me whatsoever. How many car chases do you have to see? How many people do you have to see being shot on screen and all that stuff? Yeah, give me a psychological thriller any day. Yeah. Like one of our shows, probably. Travel restrictions and implanted ID. So this was the idea from the late 60s, but there's no mention of this by R.C. Christian on the Georgia Guidestones or in the book Common Sense Renewed. Food control, of course, that is absolutely Monsanto corporates controlling the food, destroying the farming in every country. That's happened all over Europe. And food supplies would come under tight control. If population growth didn't slow down, food shortages could be created in a hurry and people would realize the dangers of overpopulation. Well, we have that thrown in our face for years. Ultimately, whether the population slows down or not, the food supply is to be brought under centralized control, which it pretty much has been. Weather control. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? This is 1969. I'm not merely referring to dropping iodide crystals into the clouds to precipitate rain. That's already there. But real control. That's a quote from Dr. Richard Day at that lecture in Mount Sinai, 1969. And weather has been used as a weapon of war and a weapon of influencing public policy, of course. Geoengineering, now openly talked about and being done in predominantly NATO countries under what I think are quotas, because in some countries, Britain's terrible for it. It always was since about 2010. But Spain's really bad. Spain's really bad. Eastern Europe, not so much. They seem to have quotas and do it on particular days for no reason. It seems to be totally random. There doesn't seem to be any particular reason they do it. Okay, side issue, but not really. He talked about knowing how people would respond and making them do what the technocrats wanted them to do. He said, Dr. Day, in 1969, something very, very insightful here. There would be falsified scientific research. Well, we've got the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change set up by the UN, which implements global to local governance through what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change say. In this audio book that I'm putting out, I've got interviews with top scientists who actually resigned over the scientific fraud of the IPCC. They're just making it up as they go along. And Dr. Richard Day was saying this. So this is an outcome, in a way, of what we were talking about with this age of enlightenment, the age of reason. Science became scientism. It became a cult. So now we hear the science as though this is a universal governing principle like God. But these people who are talking about science know nothing about it. Switch on your TV. David Attenborough knows nothing about the environment. Absolutely nothing. Brian Cox knows nothing about science. He knows about theoretical science, and he knows how to go on about the things which are implanted in his minute brain, but he's got no critical thinking abilities at all. Just goes on about theoretical science. He'll be there when they have to shut down somebody by saying climate change is real, or we went to the moon, or whatever it is. He's just there as a useful idiot. And that's what they were talking about, falsifying scientific research. That's all this is about. So terrorism, he said, there was a discussion of terrorism. Terrorism would be used widely in Europe and in other parts of the world. Well, of course, we know that that is exactly what has happened. Terrorism at that time was thought would not be necessary in the United States in 1969. That's interesting, isn't it? It could become necessary in the United States if the United States did not move rapidly enough into accepting the system. Well, of course, that was what the neocons for the Project for the New American Century in 9/11 was all about. Financial control. Authorities would be able to establish who purchased what and when. Computers would allow this to happen. The ability to save would be greatly curtailed. Well, of course, all that's happened. Surveillance, implants, and televisions that would watch you. 1969. This is what they were saying. Home ownership would be a thing of the past. There are ways round that, of course, in this sort of system that they are looting everything. Property ownership is not actually that good an idea as an investment anymore, but you can't get that over to people who are still stuck in the system. There are ways around everything, of course. He said the arrival of the totalitarian global system could be done over a weekend. So he's talking about a cyber attack or some big event which knocks down the grid, and then the new system comes in. Well, of course, COVID was used for that. COVID was used to bring in all the 5G network because there was no one about. They installed loads of stuff during those so-called lockdowns. So that did happen. Lawrence Dunnigan, the meeting attendee, said, when I first heard this, I thought it meant that people would not be killed. But as the presentation developed, what he meant was they would not be killed in such a way or disposed of in such a way that they could serve as inspiration to other people the way martyrs do, as they did in the Reformation, of course. Rather, he said something like this: people will just disappear. Just a few additional items sort of thrown in here in the end, which I failed to include where they belong more perfectly. This is Lawrence Dunnigan again, I'm just quoting directly. He said, one, the bringing in of the new system, he said, probably would occur on a weekend in the winter. Everything would shut down on Friday evening, and Monday morning, when everybody wakened, there would be an announcement that the new system was in place. Well, of course, they haven't really had to do that. But I think the most encouraging thing about all this is technocracy's already failed. I mean, all of this technocratic stuff they're trying to bring in, it's beset with problems. The infrastructure that they've got is people, and people are fallible, and they don't know how to use this stuff. And of course, it can always be hacked. So, yes, the current global governance corporate elite model of sustainable development governance, the two lies global governance system of which we talk. So, let's get now into the overview of what this system was really about, how it ended up, and where we are at the moment. Let's compare both what the two systems that were suggested said, the New Age of Reason with Robert Christian, Common Sense Renewed, and the predictions, which have all come true, of Dr. Richard Day in 1969. So what we have is cults which facilitated the objectives of Agenda 21, now Agenda 2030, or Sustainable Development, were forwarded by the UN General Secretary Robert Mueller in the 70s, and later by Maurice Strong, who single-handedly ran the United Nations Environment Programme and made statements about these coming restrictions and controlling of resources, including private property and transport. Strong headed the conference, including Rio 92. Now, I'm going to give you some quotes from the forthcoming audio book here, which I think you'll find useful. The religion of climate change and the cult of Gaia are to steer the population into mass depopulation, which was talked about here, and the biggest land grab in world history, all under the banner of sustainable development, now including COVID-19 and the driver of the Agenda 2030 goals. The World Health Organization produced a document called A Safer Future in 2007, which outlined how countries would be brought into line through global health emergencies. And you can download that in an article at Windows on the World called Know the Enemy Within. Download it. That was 2007, and it predicted exactly what happened in 2019. So the predictions of Dr. Richard Day were much more accurate than what was said much later on the Georgia Guidestones. Yeah, the hive mind of consensus. The group ideology is adopted as a belief. The belief must be shared by all. The lack of evidence for the belief results in hostility and defensiveness, using personal insults, untruths, and logical fallacies. Far-right hate speak. The group use weaponized propaganda such as denier and right-wing conspiracy theory, must be working for big oil, etc., which is ironic because the person who brought in sustainable development mostly was Maurice Strong, who made his money in the oil industry, amongst other areas. The group are led by social engineers, as talked about by Dr. Richard Day, and lobbyists, but are entirely unaware they are being used, as again talked about by Dr. Richard Day. What we have now and what we can do something about is the global to local control and management system. Let's have a quick summation of what that actually is. So we've had these projections. Now let's get into the reality. Billionaire financiers and the World Bank decided to take over all infrastructure which affects the livelihood of people, using a well thought out and highly organized control system which is enforced through propaganda, psychological manipulation, and legislation at every level of power, global to local. The world population has been coerced into a new form of original sin and will pay massive amounts in taxation and lose all rights and property on the back of a new form of benefice called sustainable development. So this includes people, property, land, all resources, energy, belief, and of course, reality. And what we have now as a result of all this is social justice, which means collectivism over individual rights, social equity, meaning poverty for all, universal basic income, as advertised, of course, by the likes of Elon Musk as a good idea. Empowerment means divide and rule, the two lies again. Vibrant communities means surveilled human settlement zones, as talked about in the documentation of the UN. Diversity equals monoculture. So globalization is rolled out through public-private partnerships. This is how it actually works. PR companies control local consultations. They identify key players and the decision makers, and they all form one unified arm of governance. So they don't need the input of the people, because these are called stakeholders. Change agents in every organizations. Mega regions are being formed to include groups of councils, which will further remove public consultation. I'm going to give you some quotes now as to how this system in the end really does work. Richard Razi, Deputy Prime Minister for Investment and Information in Slovakia. This is several years ago. I think it goes back to 2019, but they say the same thing every year. Participation. It is not possible to implement Agenda 2030 SDGs, sounds like a disease, doesn't it? The Sustainable Development Goals, actually, without the participation of all. In other words, global consensus. The SDGs are at the heart of all policy, national and local. They are foreign policies and at the core of strategic political framework. There must be partnerships among various stakeholders in every country. In other words, this global-wide imposition of unstructured global governance, which we talked about at the beginning of this show. The state, academia, private sector, and NGOs, and through regional and municipal administration, all stakeholders should play a role in the SDGs. This agenda is the most ambitious and complex plan that the international community has ever agreed on. There you go. This is what Dr. Richard Day was talking about in 1969, and it's all there through the United Nations on the real versus the state it goes. In other words, you lot are going to save the planet while we have it, while we plunder it, while we pay for offset, and you're going to live under a lie and be thankful for every crumb that you're thrown. And that is what sustainability is all about, of course. Okay, let's see what he said about policy integration. Sustainable development must be at the heart of all policies, national, regional, and local, and also foreign policies. This agenda is at the core of strategic and all political framework across all political parties, of course. It is not possible to reach our goals without the participation of all groups of people. Consensus. We must plan and invest for something which is beyond the political cycle, long-term strategies up to 2030 with a priority national investment plan. This will be the main tool to implement the SDGs. Now, this is quite interesting because a lot of the stuff that they're trying to impose is actually way behind and it's already failing. For instance, when I put the audio book out, you'll find out why it's failing. Because a lot of this stuff they're saying about projected, say, sea level rise and global cataclysms is not happening. And there's a lot of people, even within the scientific community, who are their useful idiots, are realizing this. So the only people we've got left are the extremists who are pushing it. Okay, this is Enrico Giovanni, University of Rome, president of ISTAT, the Italian Alliance for Sustainable Development. He said about this conference in 2019, instead of scanning the passes of those who attend the conference, we should ask them, what is goal 13 of the SDGs? And if they do not answer fully, they do not get in. This is a joke, but not really. This is the programmed wing of academia, which is holding up this nonsense, which is, of course, what Thomas Paine was referring to in the Age of Reason. What did the Age of Reason produce? Scientism and then consensus. And now the science. Mainstream sustainable development, what does it mean? According to Enrico Giovanni, who's in charge of it all in Italy, everything and nothing. Sustainable development means everything and nothing. In other words, it means anything they want it to mean. It means the real actually versus the stated goals. So it's the plunder of land on all resources for corporations and banks. Put simply, it's a global action plan implemented at local level for the control and management of all resources. This is getting back to the audio book I'm going to put out, and of course, many of our shows. It implements collectivism through consensus by unelected officials and takes away rights such as freedom of travel, private property, and individual freedom under a totalitarian ideology based on environmental principles and, of course, based on belief in man-made climate change, also known as AGW, anthropogenic global warming. This results in high-density cities, cycling and walking instead of private transport, and huge taxation. It destroys self-employment and small businesses in favour of corporate partners. It aims to reduce world population and end private property and land rights, smart cities, mass surveillance, and police state interference. So, what are the outcomes of all this? A recent UN survey states that birth rates are plummeting worldwide, but it's not because people don't want kids anymore. 54% said financial factors such as affordable housing, childcare options, and job security were things that had limited or would limit their ability to grow their families. 1 in 4 said health issues were holding them back. Isn't that interesting? 1 in 4? That is incredible. I wonder what caused that. 1 in 4 said health issues were holding them back. Of course, we have had vaccination programs, which was for sterilization in Africa through the Gates Foundation, but we've never had one through a pandemic before, and we'll probably get more of those. But they've already reached their goals, so none of this makes any sense anymore, you see. Their system now makes no sense because they've, in a way, reached their goals. Population is collapsing worldwide. Okay. A fifth of respondents mentioned fears about global issues, including climate change, wars, and pandemics. So there you go. The fear propaganda has worked. Pandemic sterilization. The findings come from a new survey of over 14,000 people by the United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA, spanning 14 countries on 5 continents that are home to a third of the world's population. It also includes countries with birth rates among the highest in the world, which also happens to be the most populous country on its continent. The place where the birth rate is the highest in the world is Nigeria. The others in order of population size are India, the US, Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, Germany, Thailand, South Africa, Italy, Morocco, Sweden, and Hungary. Of course, they're going right down. You know, they're pretty much plummeting. It means that they're not quite in negative yet. I think that's what they're trying to say here. It said a third of people in Sweden say they think raising a child will take up too much time and energy, and a higher number of people there compared with other countries are also concerned about climate change and bringing a child into an uncertain world. Well, Sweden was the model for democratic socialism since 1972. Look up a book called Brave New Sweden. The communitarian agenda was tried out there first. That is why they didn't have to have lockdowns during the pandemic, because people are under the thumb of their government and have been since 1972. Democratic socialism, they call it. Of course, this doesn't mean anything. It's global governance. It's what they want. It's a way of introducing the technocracy, and so that the banks and corporations can stay in charge and plunder the world. So since 2015, many countries are advising populations to actually have more children. So can we see the irony here? What those people were saying who wrote the Georgia Guidestones has happened. Population is in free fall. So those goals have been achieved. They haven't got it down to the global billion, but they're in negative. They're in negative birth rates in pretty much all countries now, apart from a few. Birth rates are plummeting and corporations rule everything. What is the purpose of this? It's achieved nothing. It's achieved nothing. Parasitic theft of property through lies, the taking of land, the poisoning and pollution continues more than ever, despite the regulations, as the big money players just buy the carbon offsets, which is another scam from NM Rothschild in the City of London, going back to a document in 2008 about carbon credits, which made the City of London the global hub of sustainable development. So just a different way of looting the planet on the back of lies for a fake self-appointed elite. So maybe that's why the Georgia Guidestones were blown up, because the people who put them up have seen what they thought was going to happen, hijacked by absolute out and out scumbag criminals. So I hope you found that useful and interesting, a bit of comparison there, and something that I've worked on for several days. One of the reasons I'm not doing a show like religiously every 7 days now is because I'm working on the audio book, but also I'm trying to take the research to a different level and combine a lot of the stuff we put out in the past. It takes a lot of time. It takes 3 or 4 days to put these ideas. It's getting the ideas together, the inspiration, because there's no way I want to go out and do what everyone else is doing out there, because when I get sent this stuff, I don't want to listen to it. So I'm hoping that there's people who want to listen to this type of stuff, and I kind of know there is, and people get information out of it, and the people who are using that information, that's what it's about. This is a lifelong learning project to continue and develop and form a new civilization. Otherwise, there's no point me sitting here. I don't want to just sit here and do a show on the internet. I never wanted to do that, actually. It's actually a bit of a strain getting up here and doing it, but you use your skills and come across as best as you can. So do support the show. Hope you've enjoyed it. Keep sending in the information, and yeah, support us on the homepage at Windows on the World. You can get links there to PayPal, Patreon, and if you want to help us out, there's a link there where you can help us out directly, because I put all my time into this, and you won't find any adverts. We're completely demonetized. Demonetized after, I think, 6 weeks. I did try it, but one thing I would never do, by the way, even if I monetize things, which I don't and I can't, is put an advert at the beginning of the show. I think that's absolutely disrespectful when people do that. I really hate it. That's why I use Brave. You can use Brave browser and get around that, by the way. So that was it. Hope you liked it, and I'll be back very soon. There's a lot of stuff that I want to put out. There's a load of stuff I want to put out, and a lot of it does revolve around what people send in to me, because that leads me on to this other areas of information. So someone can send me information about something. I'll look it up and then I'll find an old PDF that I didn't know about. And this is, I think, when I was looking up something to do with the Georgia Guidestones, because we put a show out about the Georgia Guidestones called The Guides of Chaos when they were blown up in 2022. But I didn't know that there was a book called Common Sense Renewed, written by the author of the Guidestones and put out in 1986 as a limited edition of 100 copies. Who'd have thought? But they're all out there. That's the brilliant thing about the internet. So we don't have to watch the garbage on the internet. We can look up real information and it's still there, which to me is fantastic. So yeah, lifelong learning project. Okay, great everyone. I'm going to get off now. Cheers. Bye.